This is Ian Trevethan. I am the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Sternberg Museum, and we are back with our Bringing the Museum to You from the Dome to Home Facebook live feeds. I am not alone this time. I brought a friend. This is our Paleontology Collections Manager, Chase Shelbourne.
Hello.
And he's going to talk to us sort of about what we've got here in the Kansas Seaway area, and sort of give us some ideas of how to tell the difference between
some of the reptiles that we find here in Kansas.
Kinds of sauruses, yeah, because not all sauruses are dinosaurs. So when we last spoke, I was talking about this critter. Would you be so kind as to hold this guy? So this is our Niobrarasaurus. He is a bona fide, no pun intended, Kansas dinosaur. And we talked a little bit about, what makes him kind of unique. The difference between a nodosaurid and an ankylosaurid. An ankylosaurid, of course, has the big club tail. Nodosaurids do not. Nodosaurids also have different arrangements of spikes on their shoulders, which I forgot to mention. The other thing that I wanted to follow up on, and some people asked some pretty good questions about it, is the teeth of nodosaurs. So if you can focus on our little nodosaur tooth here. Let me actually turn it around here just a bit. There we go. So there's the tip of my big old finger. And that just gives you an idea of size. Now this is a very interesting shaped tooth. It's what I would call almost leaf-shaped.
Leaf-shaped.
And we do believe that they were herbivorous or plant eaters, but we're not exactly sure how they use their teeth. Maybe to scoop or scrape parts of plants away, the softer stuff. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what these teeth look like. So that's what I was talking about when I said they had really interesting teeth. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to turn it over to Chase, and he's going to sort of start with, is it another kind of dinosaur?
Yes, so as Ian mentioned this morning, we don't really get a lot of dinosaurs here in Kansas because we were under a seaway. Dinosaurs are pretty much exclusively terrestrial, meaning they lived on land with a handful of exceptions. So the only dinosaurs we really get out here in Kansas are dinosaurs that were coastal, that lived near the coast, and when they died, their bodies actually washed out through rivers and things out into the sea, where they would sink and eventually be preserved in marine sediments. So another example of that, Ian will hold up here, we get hadrosaurs in addition to our nodosaurs. So this is an example of hadrosaur tail vertebra, and for sort of the common name for hadrosaurs are duck-billed dinosaurs. So these would have been big duck-billed dinosaurs, sort of like Camptosaurus or Edmontosaurus and things like that. And these, like the Niobrarasaurus, would have been float and bloat, so they would have actually died, bloated up, washed out to sea, eventually sunk, and then these vertebrae would have been preserved. So we don't get a lot of dinosaurs, but we do get a lot of reptiles. But not every reptile that you find, despite a lot of myths in popular culture, not every reptile you see from the Mesozoic is actually a dinosaur. So two other kinds of reptiles we get here fairly often in the seaway are our mosasaurs and our plesiosaurs. And so if you want to look at this wall over here, you'll see an example of a mosasaur, a Tylosaurus. Very elongate, almost snake-like animal. And if we turn over here towards this case, we can see a Dolichorhynchops, which is a type of plesiosaur, much more rotund, barrel-shaped body and a much smaller head. And so the question now is, are these animals different, and how do you tell them apart? So dinosaurs, again, are terrestrial, so they're on land, they're walking around. They have limbs really adapted for locomotion on land, walking around in a terrestrial environment. But if we look at the limbs of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, what you'll find, again, if you want to grab the plesiosaur, is that they're adapted as paddles. So especially in the plesiosaur over here, if you want to look at this guy, you'll see finger bones, which have a lot of duplication in the individual bones, and they're almost fused together into a paddle.
So these little bones here are called phalanges, and when you come across fingers that have this many finger bones, we call that hyperphalange, which is just a fancy science word for saying lots of finger bones.
Yep.
So I would call this almost a paddle shape.
Yep. And if you think of your own fingers, you have what, 3 individual phalanges? 4?
Yeah, 1, 2. I can't remember how to count right now. We're descending into madness already.
But you'll see how many more the plesiosaur has by comparison. This is also a flipper or a paddle, depending on how you want to say it, but this is of a mosasaur. And if you didn't know any better, you might look at this and just say, that just looks like a normal hand, like the hand you'd see on a lizard. And that's because, unlike the plesiosaur, the mosasaur has a lot less of that hyperphalange. The fingers aren't closely constrained to one another, and this would have been more of a webbed-like paddle versus the very a web-like flipper.
Oar-shaped, yeah. Less oar-shaped and more,
like a hand.
like a hand with some
Material
stuff connecting it.
Exactly. And that's not a coincidence. So if we want to go for a short walk, we can sort of talk about the differences between these two animals. So if we want to come over
with
here.
the plesiosaurs, talk with the plesiosaurs.
So you'll notice if we look at our plesiosaur or Dolichorhynchops over here, you'll see those paddles in life position. And you'll notice, again, the very squat body and also the very short tail. So plesiosaurs had these very strong, robust paddles because they were propelled primarily by their paddles. So they have a lot of muscle attachment and very powerful paddles for pushing themselves through the water. By contrast, their tails are very short, which they weren't really using to swim. If we want to come over here and look at our mosasaur on display, our Tylosaurus, you'll notice it's very differently constructed. It has an extremely elongate snake-like body, an almost snake-like head, and a very, very long tail. And so what Tylosaurs, the way they actually swam, was they were propelled by their tail and by their trunk muscles, their body muscles. Their flippers or paddles were not really being used to propel themselves through the water, so they didn't have the same amount of fusion and the same amount of strength. Tylosaurs would have been using their paddles to basically change direction, position themselves in the water, maintain aquadynamics while they're swimming, but they would have been pushing themselves along actually by their bodies. Very similar to how snakes and lizards swim, if you've ever seen them. Another difference you can see sort of between these different sea creatures is their vertebrae. So if you're out on your property and you find a vertebrae, you don't know what it is. This that I have on my right here is a plesiosaur vertebra, part of the backbone, and it has a condition which we call amphicoelous, which basically is Latin for double hollowed. So both sides are concave, meaning they dip in. So this side, which would be the anterior or the front of the animal, has a concavity, and the back side of the vertebrae, which would be the posterior back side of the animal, also has a concavity.
So both sides look like they've kind of been a melon that's been scooped out.
Fair. By contrast, we have some mosasaur verts over here. And first off, they're shaped differently. They're much longer. So if you want to hold it sort of in profile here, this one would be better.
Okay.
You can see how much longer the vertebrae is. But also, let's switch. These vertebrae have a condition which is called procoelous, which is basically Latin for forward-facing cavity. So they have a concavity on one side, but the other side is not concave, it's actually convex. It has this rounded edge, and that allows the vertebrae, like Ian was showing a minute ago, to sort of fit together like this, or more like this, something like that.
So when you think about the motion that this animal would have had to use to propel itself through the water, back and forth.
Yep.
So a ball and socket setup is a really, really good construction to be able to move your body in that sort of side-to-side motion.
And something else you'll find on mosasaur vertebrae are these neural spines, which are very tall and very broad. And that's actually to allow for a lot of muscle attachment along the back. Because again, they're using their bodies primarily for swimming. They have to have very strong muscles in their tail and along their spine as well. So that's the difference between their vertebrae. But we've mentioned several times sort of the snake-like swimming of mosasaurs. That also is not a coincidence. So over here, Ian has the skull of a mosasaur.
Wait, before you get off of the vertebra,
sure.
We have a question is, do the vertebra show evidence of arthritic changes or cancers?
None of the ones that I'm aware of here do, but I do know that there are actually examples of the mosasaur vertebra that show examples of the bins.
Same with plesiosaurs as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I think we've got some
Oh, really?
in our collection. There's a thin section that shows some tissue damage in the middle. So yes.
Yeah, and
Sort
there's
of.
and there's probably arthritic bones out there as well. We do have bones that have evidence of arthritis. I don't know if we have any vertebra off the top of my head
Yeah,
that do.
I mean, I would imagine they got
But
old and got arthritis,
almost,
just
yeah,
like
almost
everything else
certainly.
does.
Yep.
But none of the ones that you were showing here.
No.
No, not yet. No, I don't think so.
No, there is definitely deformation where you can
Yes.
see things have been flattened out and sort of twisted over the long periods of time and being under pressure, and
Yes.
bones kind of get squished. So if those vertebrae look a little strange to you, that's because they are. So good eye.
And again, mentioning going back to sort of the snake-like habits of mosasaurs.
Coolest skulls ever.
Yes, so this is a very cool 3D preserved skull. Let's flip it first, just to orient people. So this is actually the top of the skull. Like was Ian mentioned with the vertebrae, it's been very much flattened, but you can see the nostrils are right here. The eye sockets go here. Here's the nose up here, and here's the back of the skull. Now if we go ahead and flip it, you can see the jaws. And the first thing you'll probably notice is the upper jaw. These are its teeth, deeply socketed, sharp teeth. These are predators. They were swimming around eating other animals in the seaway. But if you look really close over here, you'll see a little set of accessory teeth on a bone called the pterygoid. So these are called pterygoid teeth. And this feature, along with several other features, are some of the best evidence we have about the relationships of mosasaurs. So because of these teeth, we know that mosasaurs are very closely related to a modern animal, specifically snakes and varanid lizards, both of which also possess very similar.
What is a good example of a varanid lizard?
So y'all may not be familiar with the term varanid, but you're probably familiar with the term Komodo dragon. So one of the closest living relatives of mosasaurs is actually the Komodo dragon. The biggest lizard alive today lives in Indonesia, and it had some even bigger aquatic cousins that lived during the Cretaceous here in the seaway.
And if you look closely, there's this little bump here. It's a
Right.
little spot here that you can actually see on things like Komodo dragons.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of water monitors at the museum.
And if any of you have pet iguanas, they also have these. This is called the pineal foramen. And so that is the spot where they have a third eye called the pineal eye, which allows for light detection. And it's another feature that's really common in a lot of lizards. And were you going to add?
I was just going to say, it doesn't take much to imagine this animal alive.
Right.
When I look at this skull, I'm there, man.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people will confuse these animals for crocodiles. They're very crocodilian in shape, but really what they are is giant marine lizards, very closely related to some modern lizards today. By contrast, our plesiosaurs, like this guy, have no living relatives alive today. They are a much more ancient group than mosasaurs, going back all the way to the Triassic. And even though they're similar in some ways to mosasaurs, they actually left behind no descendants. So they are a completely different group of reptiles. And both of these groups are different from dinosaurs, which are actually more closely related to things like crocodilians and birds. Do you have anything else to add?
The one thing that always helped me figure out what is a plesiosaur and what is a mosasaur, of course, you've got a lot of clues. You've got the lack of the second set of teeth on the roof of the mouth of a plesiosaur. You've got the flippers. You've got the generally shorter tail. The other thing is, it seems to me like plesiosaurs have pretty flat skull tops. We call them skull tables. Generally, they tend to have a sort of a flatter top of the skull. And in fact, I do believe that Dolichorhynchops actually means flat-nosed face. So,
Okay.
again, it's a good example of
Yeah.
paleontological specimen,
And
basically being named for its shape rather than a geographic interest.
yeah, and Tylosaurus, our mosasaur, is also named for the shape of its face, because
Right.
tylos means blunt nose.
Well, there we go.
So it's blunt-nosed reptile or blunt-nosed lizard. But despite the fact that at first glance these two animals would seem very similar, they definitely inhabited very different parts of the ecosystem. Again, you have the probably slightly slower moving rounded plesiosaurs versus the very streamlined mosasaurs, which they unfortunately all went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, along with many of our non-avian dinosaurs. So
It was a rough time.
it was for everybody.
So, like before, we are looking for you to send us questions. We would like to answer as many as we can in real time, but we'll also check back as the day goes on and try to answer any questions that we might have missed later on after the live cast is done.
We do have one more question.
We have
here.
one more question. All right.
Were mosasaurs solitary, or did they travel in groups?
That's a good question.
I think generally they were pretty, at least the big ones were pretty territorial. We've got some pretty good evidence. Actually, there's some evidence over here that they may very well have been territorial. So if you look at this skull here, this is a skull of Tylosaurus kanzensis, and you'll notice that there are blue arrows pointing to some interesting features on the skull. Those look to be tooth marks. And it would appear to me that this particular skull has been actually crushed from both sides. So that would probably have been what killed this animal. And as it turns out, those teeth match up very well with another mosasaur, a bigger, badder mosasaur. So that would give us a couple of, or I guess it would support the hypothesis that mosasaurs were very likely territorial.
And we also have evidence from modern animals, like, again, Komodo dragons, which also tend to be very territorial. And it also depends on a lot of lizards, because some lizards will get in big groups, they'll become gregarious when doing things like feeding, but the rest of the time they'll defend their territories and they'll be totally solitary. So looking at things like some modern snakes and varandid lizards like Komodo dragons, we can also sort of begin to speculate and hypothesize as to how these animals actually lived.
Okay, have we got any more questions?
No more.
All right, well, that is pretty much unless you've got something to add, I think that'll wrap us up. I did want to take this opportunity to, number one, thank everybody who has participated both this morning and this afternoon in asking us questions and liking our Facebook page and sharing these posts.
And keep sharing even after the live stream's over.
Yeah,
and keep
these
asking
are
questions.
All going to be shareable, and like I said, we will continue to look at our Facebook page and answer questions as they come in. It's important to us that you know we're here, that we want to interact with you. I personally would go crazy if I were sitting at home, so that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm continuing to do the job of education and outreach. So we will be here for as long as we can possibly hold out.
Keep you all informed.
And we plan on continuing to do this indefinitely. So the other thing I wanted to do is we actually had a couple of groups and field trips scheduled this week, and I just want to give a shout out to some of those groups that I was going to be working with and unfortunately can't. So first of all, I'd like to say hey to the Brewster School students. We were due to visit Brewster School tomorrow. Unfortunately, that's not happening because, well, no school. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the Boy Scouts in Manhattan because they were due to come and have a sleepover here at the museum. We were going to work on getting them their geology and herpetology merit badges. So guys, when everything gets back to normal, we will definitely do that. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. Let us know if there's anything you're curious about that we can talk about in the museum and help you understand. Until tomorrow, I'm Ian.
I'm Chase.
And we'll see you later.